It's showtime.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
You know, the right to bear arms is because that's the last form of defense against tyranny.
Washington is fundamentally corrupt. There are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible.
Made in America, heard round the world. You're listening to Blunt Force Truth. I'm Chuck Woolery, along with my co-host Mark Young, and President Trump is putting down Joe Biden on foreign soil. Who would think it, that a Republican would actually go to foreign soil and say something bad about Joe Biden, when in fact every Democrat, Obama included, have gone to foreign soil and put down Mike Huckabee, Trump. I mean, you name it. I mean, it's unacceptable when Trump does it.
That's everything. When Trump breathes, it is unacceptable.
What is it?
Taking in oxygen is unacceptable when Trump does it.
God, they're just exercised over everything, aren't they?
Yeah, and Biden is the front runner right now.
Do you really believe that'll last? Because I can't imagine that'll last, other than the fact that he has great name recognition and, obviously history that people identify with. But I still think there's going to be someone come out of the woodwork and tap him.
Well, as you know, these things change dramatically. I mean, look at how
we only have about 2 years or year and a half or whatever it is. I mean, good Lord.
So, there are certain people in the race that we can pretty much guarantee are not going to become president. I mean, like Marianne Williamson and
Swalwell.
Right. Just give it up.
Swalwell's out there talking. I mean, he's zero. He's at zero. Some are minus zero. It's just incredible.
Yeah, Marianne Williams was actually -1. I don't know how you do that.
I don't even know who she is.
Marianne Williams was the co-author of the book The Secret.
Oh, well, that explains it right there.
So, Chuck, let me help you.
It's a secret, and so is she.
But she shared the secret, and the secret is this.
Yeah, what's the secret?
The secret is, if you envision what you want in life, and you envision it strong enough and powerfully enough, the universe will grant your wishes.
Oh, the universe. Well,
the universe will grant it.
What, is there any particular part of the universe or the entire universe?
The entire universe. Wow. It's called the law. They call it the law of attraction.
Wow.
So as long as you sit there and obey the law of attraction, you can attract anything to you. So as an example,
let me try this. Yeah, it's coming to me. Mm-hmm.
I saw a bug go by. I think you were attracting flies when you did that. There must be something about the resonance in your voice.
Yeah.
So if you, for example, if you sit on your couch.
For example, okay, give me an example.
You sit on the couch, you watch Ellen, you eat some bonbons.
And you want to be just like Ellen.
And you sit there and you say, I want to live in a mansion and drive a Rolls Royce. Mm-hmm. If you believe it hard enough, if you believe it with all your might, the universe will grant your wish.
I just wanted to live in an apartment and have a Volkswagen that ran because they're easy to work on.
Now, I do believe there is some legitimacy to the law of attraction, that I think people are attracted to people who are successful.
Yes, that's true. Mm-hmm.
So I do think success attracts success.
There always has to be a monicum of truth to every lie, or it doesn't work.
But I think there's that whole part of just sitting there, and you have to, by the way, there's a key to this. You have to make up a vision board.
Yes.
So you have to take a big piece of cardboard and put pictures of the house you want to live in on it and stare at it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well.
And she wants to be president.
Of course she does.
So Biden, by the way, back to reality, if you want to call it that, or is that what they're calling it now? But anyways, Biden is now saying that the robust economy that we are experiencing
is Obama's creation.
It's the Obama-Biden creation.
Yeah, they've been trying to do that for a long time. I don't think people are going to buy that, though, other than the diehard Democrats. They won't buy that.
Maybe Biden left that magic wand behind in the White House.
Well, maybe so. Somebody had got a hold of it, that's for sure.
But that's what it took to get this economy. The president had to have a magic wand, so apparently he had one. But Biden is now taking credit for it. And the reality is, Chuck, that everyone knows that the reason that Obama selected Biden in the first place as vice president was just to prove to America he didn't really need one.
And he didn't want one either. He really didn't. He just, had to do it because it's formality.
There was a requirement.
There was a requirement, correct. Yes.
And he thought to himself, who would be the least capable person that I could put in that spot?
Who thinks I'm clean and speak well and good looking.
Oh my God, that was amazing. Yeah. Well,
I always wondered where did the word clean come from? I mean, it's like he took a bath every day. I mean, how do you do that?
He was articulate
and clean
and good looking and clean.
Clean.
But the best part was he was the first black man on the scene who was articulate,
right,
and good looking and clean.
Not discriminatory or anything.
So up until then, black people had not been bathing up until this time, according to Joe Biden, along with, this is the same Joe Biden who says, you can't go to a 7-Eleven without a mild Indian accent.
Well, I always wondered what that was all about. What do you mean you can't go to one? And he also included Dunkin' Donuts in that as well.
Dunkin' Donuts has got an Indian accent.
Donuts or 7-Eleven.
So you just have to walk in and say, excuse me, can you point me to the Slurpee machine? I mean, is that what you have to do?
They wouldn't understand you.
When you go into a 7-Eleven?
Yeah, all right.
Or just touch the red dot on my head and people poking me in the head saying, get out of my country. So anyways, a little bit of fan mail here, Chuck.
Welcome, folks. Welcome to Blunt Force Truth, by the way. We're happy to have you listening, and we won't get to your calls later.
No. Well, I'm going to cover a bit of fan mail here.
Okay.
I so enjoy Blunt Force Truth. Thank you for your time that you take to tell us what the present federal government is doing. I thank you and your co-host, Mark, and give you grace.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
That was very nice.
Yeah.
Then there was this one. Take your blank lies and shove them so far up your blank, you choke on them.
Well, and there's that.
Now this is the one that I really like.
Everyone happy.
This is from the left. This is a guy on the left who is angry with us that we're trying to divide America, and we're not being warm and loving.
Mm-hmm.
So to demonstrate to us how we're not being warm and loving,
yes,
he says, "Did your whore of mothers never teach you that lying is a sin?"
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a loving comment. When you love someone, you always insult their dead mother.
You know who's dividing this country? We talk about this all the time. The country's divided. Trump divided the country. Obama divided the country. I'll tell you who's dividing the country every single day and every minute of every day. The media.
Yeah, CNN.
The country, period. Well, it's not just CNN. I mean, it's
MSNBC,
WAPO, you name it.
They all are.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, we're going to get to a guest now. Our guest today is Michael Johns.
Mm-hmm.
So Michael's going to be an interesting guy. He was a national co-founder and leader of the Tea Party movement, mm-hmm. and he was also a former White House speechwriter and Heritage Foundation policy analyst. So this is the real deal. This is a guy on the inside who has that Beltway experience and has the grassroots experience, which I find very interesting.
Right.
He's been on both sides of the fence on this topic. Mm-hmm. So, Michael, welcome to Blunt Force Truth.
Hey, it's a pleasure, guys. Happy Monday to you.
Thank you.
Tuesday, actually.
Tuesday, happy whatever day it is.
Yeah.
It's nice to have you, Michael. You know, Michael, I know you're a conservative. Pleasure. I know you've done a lot of things with the conservative world, that you stand on conservative principles. Let me ask you a question that I don't think anyone has ever answered fully, and people understand it. There are so many misconceptions of what a conservative is. And so I would like for you to define conservatism for me, like me and Mark, we're conservatives. What are we? As we're not Republican conservatives. We're not Democrat conservatives. We're not libertarian conservatives. We are conservatives. What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, and I think part of the misinterpretation is people who tend to confuse political conservatism with maybe social conservatism. And, many of us who've grown up, are, not tuned out to what's going on in the world around us and whatnot, and are glued in and, like rock music and like things that are current. But from the standpoint of political conservatism, it's really always been rooted in a recognition of the genius of the American Constitution and a realization that we need to adhere to that rule of law, that we cannot deviate from that we're a country of liberty, that ultimately it is the people of the United States, not our government, that maintains control. A belief really that our liberties come from God, not from government, which is to say that government is not empowered to take those rights away from us. A belief generally, I think, that the free market economies and freedom works better than controlled economies, which I think is a documentable historical fact. And then, a recognition that the country's security, that its peace is ultimately encouraged by strength, not by weakness. This is, you may call this the lessons of Munich, the lessons of history, but that, and it may seem counterintuitive to some, but that it is actually our strength as a nation that deters aggression against us around the world and here at home. And then I would say finally, it's a belief in some sort of social structure that generally the family structure is a very positive one for upbringing of children and for societal cohesion, and a rejection of kind of any rebelliousness against historically proven truths. So those can be economic truths, those can be, as I mentioned, national security truths, that can be social truths, but I think it's got much more of a science attached to it than our liberal counterparts, who sort of come up with ideas sort of on the whim, based more on their political motives than on any documented evidence of what has or has not historically worked.
Well, let me walk you back a little bit and see if you can answer this for me. Was there a time when conservatism ruled our politics in Washington? Was there a time in our neighborhoods and our cities and counties and states? Was there a time when conservatism, the idea of conservatism, was universal in our country?
Yeah, I think you could look at that, historically, or you could look at it through, say, just the lives of most living Americans. I think generally you could take the principles of our founders, who did deviate on some really substantial issues, but recognize that by and large, they embraced every one of these values and ideals that I just mentioned. So in many respects, the very revolution against British colonialism was in a lot of ways a conservative rebellion and a conservative revolution. And, I would say more recently in modern times, I think you could look at what I would say the grassroots political movements that were attached, I guess, chronologically to the Reagan movement of not even just 1980, but all the way back to his first candidacies in 1964, on to his successful candidacy in 1980. You certainly could look at the Tea Party movement, and I think you could look at this current president of reflecting ideals.
Let me interrupt and say this. Was there a time in history that you're aware of when, let's say that up until a particular time, Democrats and Republicans were both conservative, but they were both conservative parties, but they kind of wanted to come at government in different ways. We had our differences, but by and large, we were both basically conservative. Was there a time, well, number one, would you agree with that? And then number two, is there a time in history, recent or otherwise, that started to break? The Democrats begin to break away from Republicans begin to break away as well.
And Chuck, let me add to that. As you're saying, a time when they were both conservative, let me throw another thought in there is, was there ever a time when they were both nationalists?
Yeah, I think you could say that nationalism generally prevailed politically in the country, until roughly the 1970s.
Really?
When you started to have... I think you clearly the country's history is one of divisiveness. I mean, and in some cases, in the case of the Civil War, even armed divisiveness. So, I mean, a free society does sort of predispose a country to colliding ideologies and political forces. But I think when you look at the founding principles of the country and the principles that by and large governed the first 100 or 150 years of the country, there was generally an embrace of principles that I think could largely be called conservatism. And it really wasn't until you sort of had the New Deal, the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson, where you sort of have a recognition among those on the left that government should be doing a lot more.
You wouldn't go back any further to progressivism starting in the late 1800s and then really getting on steroids with Woodrow Wilson and then continuing past Coolidge?
Well, you would with Wilson because of his globalist inclinations. So I think you had in Wilson a president who sort of was focused in many respects on priorities throughout the world, and that placed him at odds with some of more nationalist conservatism. But I don't think you had really an impression of Wilson as someone who is threatening to the underlying values of conservatism, even though he was a Democrat. The Democratic Party, of course, has gone through massive transitions in ideology.
And progressive as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, from the standpoint of looking at a lot of international institutions as a mechanism for relieving issues, and as a believer generally in an expanded government. And he was an intellectual, of course. I believe he was one of the first presidents of Princeton University. So he sort of brought onto that some of the academic elitism, one might say, to governance.
So
and those issues.
This whole historical road. But I think it clarifies kind of where we are as a nation, how we got there, who we are. It's gotten to the point where people who say they're conservative are almost afraid to say that. It's like Trump voters are afraid to say, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump without being ridiculed by everyone around them. So they keep it a secret and then go in and do it privately. Conservatives have almost meant the same kind of disgust from the average person. Or, I mean, if I went on the Bill Maher show, for instance, on HBO, and I've done it before, but many years ago, I wasn't really defined in my political views at the time. But if I went on and claimed I was conservative, I would be pillared and beaten and made fun of and everything else and called an idiot. And so it's that ridicule that goes along with the word conservative that I'm trying to clear up as to what exactly are they talking about, when I just don't think they have it right, of course. But I thought it was important because I know that you can
I think
very conservative, values in your life.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons their tactics are so personalized and combative is ultimately they sort of pull away from the substance of a lot of these debates. So if you look at kind of the pillars of conservatism that I just laid out, that individual liberty as opposed to a nationally, governmentally controlled society is better, that's a no-brainer to most Americans. Right. If most Americans say that's what conservatism is, they say I'm a conservative. On economic conservatism, if you say, look, a free market economy that unleashes the ingenuity and entrepreneurship of man is better than a governmentally controlled economy. History makes that like an undocumentable truth. I mean, even in the most liberal world, that's just scientifically provable.
Well, in the
and
economy,
if you kind of went
Obama and Biden,
if you went the next,
Obama and Biden could have done exactly.
Finally, if you went the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just said Obama and Biden could have done exactly the same thing that Trump did to get the economy rolling again. They could have cut regulations, they could have cut taxes, but the Democrats never do that. And so economically, they have this socialist Keynesian kind of view of the world that is, resides in Washington, and that's where everything happens, when in fact, once you loose up our industrial might, it's overwhelming what we can accomplish, and yet they refuse to do it. They want to restrain.
That's right.
They want to restrain us all the time, when in fact we want to be unleashed.
Well, and I think ultimately that contemporary liberalism is a much more politically charged movement than conservatism. I mean, I think within conservative circles, you have these enduring principles, but there's a certain level of pragmatism that sort of says, well, what's going to, outside of not betraying any of these founding principles, what's going to make the society and the country work most effectively? And within the left and the discussions that exist among the left, it's much more a question of, well, what's going to advance our political power and our political control? And, so a single payer healthcare system that makes essentially every American beholden to government is politically empowering to them. Conservatives would look at that and say, no, the market forces that exist, particularly within healthcare innovation and development, are crucial to us maintaining the type of healthcare delivery system that we have in the world. They might look at even this border debate and say, look, flooding the country with illegals, many of whom don't speak English, many of whom have no developed skills and are immediately unemployable, and overwhelming our welfare systems, ultimately proves destabilizing to society in ways that are empowering politically to them. Those, I think, of more conservative persuasion will look at it more practically and say, no, we need a sensibly controlled immigration program that is, thoughtfully designed and fair and, and reasonable. So I think that's kind of why there's such violent collisions lately between these two ideologies, is because it's not even a question over what is the best methodology to get to one singular end, but disagreements over what that singular end is. So if you ask a conservative, what is the ideal sort of end game? What kind of country will we have? I think you would want to say we'd want a fast-growing, economically thriving nation of vast promise and opportunity for Americans. We'd want a country that's secure from external threats. We want a country that has some sort of general sense of social stability and national identity. If you went on the left, it might be the complete opposite of every one of those things. So I think particularly those who are close to it, and I feel like I have been, you start to see in the left some very threatening, not just methodologies, but end games for what they want to turn the country into. And clearly, if you have any respect for the founding principles of the country, including our Bill of Rights, you have to be immensely concerned about the way that they're approaching this and what their end game actually is.
Where's the Tea Party today?
So the Tea Party movement, obviously emerged in 2009. I think, constructively it, blocked Obama's legislative ability to really advance the agenda he wanted to. I think it laid the groundwork in a lot of ways for Trump's populist campaign in 2016 that allowed Trump. We always say the conventional wisdom is, well, the Republicans won in 2016. It's important to point out Trump really ran against the Republican Party.
Right.
And that's not something that would have likely been possible 2 or 3 presidential terms prior. It was possible in large part because of the Tea Party movement. And then, of course, as the very visible rallies that we held across the country sort of became identifiable with the movement itself, I think a lot of people forgot that really ultimately we were about winning elections and impacting policy. So the movement itself has gone from, to a lot of engagement in our political process. I mean, many of those who led our movement organizationally over the last decade have ascended into local and even national office. So the movement itself, I think, has become much more an acceptable means. It's clearly altered the Republican Party in the country, in my view, in very constructive ways, both from a policy standpoint and a political standpoint. And most importantly, it continues to provide one of the great avenues for engagement in our political process for those who look at our founding principles with admiration. And incredibly, if you go back to 2009, I would always have people who would contact me and say, you know, I want to do something. And these would be people that didn't have historically a lot of political or public policy experience, but they had constructive goals and constructive ends in mind. And you can never really point to the Republican Party as sort of a national organization that could assimilate vast levels of ongoing activism. They were very good in deploying them for election purposes, but you know, those were cycles and were not consistently available opportunities. So I think that's really been the great opportunity, is to assimilate what ultimately was tens of millions of Americans into the political process who otherwise would have been on the sidelines. And I think that manifested in, well, the question of whether it'll reemerge in the visible way that it did in 2009, 2010 depends in large part on the direction of the country. I mean, unfortunately, political activism tends to be more motivated by concerns over the negatives and supports for the positives. So clearly this president could use a lot of support right now. I think the Tea Party movement, by and large, is completely on board with this president's agenda. I support him on day one. Others sort of came around more slowly to him, but they do embrace, you know, his direction and whatnot. And I think, as you know, Trump himself, importantly, you know, spoke at Tea Party rallies 2011, supported the movement rhetorically, and I think he may have even financially supported it in some small ways. So I mean, he less known to people is really someone that I think those in the movement have considered an ally. And why not? Because I think generally, while he's kind of redefining conservatism a bit in 21st century relevance, he's governing as one of the most conservative presidents in the history of this country.
Now, why don't we see more from the Tea Party? I mean, we used to have Tea Party rallies every place. And is that because of what you're saying, that we kind of won by getting Trump in? Or did the attack on the Tea Party by the IRS under Obama have a chilling effect on the Tea Party movement?
The IRS attack on the conservative targeting of the Tea Party movement did have a hugely detrimental effect in the particularly the 2012 presidential election, which I think was its primary goal. So we had many organizations with pending applications for nonprofit or C4 status that could have been activated in support of that election cycle, and were not as a result of it. So I think it clearly had a detrimental impact on Romney's campaign, which from the standpoint of most Tea Party activists was not particularly well managed or well structured anyway. And it had an ongoing impact. But the real, I think, evolution of things is, if you go back and say, well, what's different today than 10 years ago? It's that in 2009, we had President Obama with a clear perceived national mandate. You had a vast number of Americans who were uneducated about his radical ways and sort of saw him as wrongly as some sort of centrist political force. You had a House that was in the control of Nancy Pelosi, a Senate that was in the control of Harry Reid, federal courts that were vastly more to the left than they are today, and even state assemblies and governorships that were much more to the left and much more in the hands of the Democratic Party than they are today. So systematically, I mean, if you can go back and recall the promises that we made, and I even personally made to the American people, I said, we're going to take our government back. Not we're going to try to win a few races here and there, be a little more representative. We're going to take our government back. That was a very bold promise, and I think, looking around the magnitude of the movement, a lot of us felt, and I certainly felt, that it was possible. It didn't view it as a preordained conclusion, but it was certainly was possible. And then systematically in 2010, with the massive election of Tea Party affiliated conservatives, dozens upon whom didn't just run as saying, yeah, the Tea Party movement's a good thing, but said I'm part of the Tea Party movement. They not only took the House back from Nancy Pelosi, but transformed the Republican Party within the House of Representatives and the way the Republican Party does things politically in the House of Representatives. And then 2014, of course, very prominently, not only did the Tea Party movement essentially drive Republicans taking back the Senate, but many of the most prominent senators today, and some of those who emerged in the 2016 race, themselves ran as Tea Party affiliated candidates. You had Marco Rubio in Florida, you had Mike Lee in Utah, you had Rand Paul in Kentucky, you had Ted Cruz in Texas, all of whom, ran saying, not just I kind of like the Tea Party movement or think it's a good thing, but ran saying I am one of you. And which is one of the reasons there was a lot of, I think, division in 2016 in the primary over who the Tea Party movement should get behind. Many of my, closer allies in this movement were aligned with Ted Cruz because they kind of knew him as Ted. He was the guy that we worked with to get elected. And then others, like myself, sort of saw in Trump the outsider status and administrative skill sets and even the personal demeanor that I believe are necessary to really win the sort of battles over the swamp that we're fighting today. So in essence, that is an unbelievable political success story of the last 10 years.
There's no question that the Tea Party was a success. There's absolutely no question about that. And by the way, we're going to take a short break for one of our sponsors, Blue Emu, and we'll be back with Michael Johns. And I have another question for him right after this. Blue Emu works fast and you won't stink. This episode of Blunt Force Truth is brought to you by Blue Emu Pain Relief Products. Now, I've been in show business for many years now, and I'm not slowing down, but I can use a little help every now and then. Blue Emu's family of products are made in America and have become a staple in my life. The deep penetrating formula of Blue Emu Original is best for supporting my muscles and joints, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's on the shelf in a blue and white jar. I also use Maximum Arthritis for any arthritic pain and the lidocaine cream for numbing pain relief. Not only do these Blue Emu formulas work great, there's no chill, no burn, and no odor. Blue Emu, it works fast and you won't stink. Available at Walmart, Walgreens, CVS, Amazon, and other fine retailers. So we're back, Michael. The Tea Party kind of reminds me of something in history. It reminds me of Calvin Coolidge, who was a great president, who did great things for America, the Roaring 20s, everything that happened, and he was asked to run again after, I guess, he could run again because his president died while he was in office, and then he became president. So he had an opportunity to run again, and his response to running again was, look, I don't need to run again. I've fixed the country, which primarily he kind of did up to that point. Then we got Hoover, and then we got FDR. We're in the middle of a depression. All good things conservative have gone by the wayside. And then we go through, FDR, the Second World War, the whole thing. And then we never hear from the Coolidgeites again until Reagan comes into office. And the only thing we hear about Coolidge is he hangs his picture in the Oval Office because he admired him so much. So here's what I'm asking. The Tea Party obviously was extraordinarily effective. There's no question about it. It pulled people into it that really wanted to have a voice. It gave voice to those who didn't have a voice. And then all of a sudden, it kind of disappeared. It was an activist organization that all of a sudden became inactive because it accomplished everything it needed to accomplish. And yet, you need to constantly keep that to reinforce it. The left does this better than anybody. They never give up. They go to war every day. And we go to war, we win the war, and then we go away. And then we have to come back and win another war because we don't stay involved and connected. And so the Tea Party is going to become a memory to people that's going to be distant in a very short period of time, unless someone like this activist group And I don't know why it wouldn't be them, because the name is still viable. They still have brand recognition. Why someone doesn't stir these people back up and say, okay, we need to stay active in order to continue to win, instead of just declaring victory and going in the foxholes and, back home.
Right. Yeah, I think in essence what you're pointing to is some of the differences even in personal demeanor between conservatives and liberals. Liberals sort of live and die for political activism. It's much more in their blood.
They wake up and go to war.
Yeah, it's a war. It's a war to them. There's almost not really much that they won't say or do to advance their ends. And historically, this I think is certainly been the case throughout our lifetime. You can go back to, even Buckley's early commentary on conservatism has been more of a necessary evil in the minds of most conservatives. Well, I guess we got to go out there and do something about all this stuff. And you're absolutely correct
right.
that's not really the way
to
go about winning. Yeah, I mean, it'd be like the NFL team is like, I guess we got to go out and play this game now. I mean, you got to show up, not just with a battle plan, but with a cohesive strategy for victory, and then you got to work together as a team. That's another issue. As I think conservatives,
Michael, is the Tea Party proved that it could be done.
Yes, they have. Well, and the people did. I think a lot that can be drawn from that is the distinction. The distinction, and I've worked in Washington conservative organizations that I would not disparage, but there's limitations to what Washington institutions can do to actually influence the country, because the country views them so skeptically. Whereas citizen movement, like the Tea Party movement, that arises so organically. And it's important to remember, when we had the first organizing calls on which I was on, we didn't envision that it would develop into a sustainable political movement. We wanted to have one day of national rallies across the country.
Excuse me, my friend, the Revolutionary War was a citizen movement.
Exactly, it was, and thus why it was successful as well. And I think the same is true today, is that the American people need to not rely on Washington, including our allied organizations, as really holding necessarily all of the answers to what we need to do. Realize that, in a sense, all of those organizations are influenced by Washington money and whatnot to some extent, and that really directing this country in the way we want to direct it, and in making sure that our founding principles are enduring principles in this country means that every citizen needs to not just be engaged, but be engaged in a collective way, which I think you can almost do a psychological profile, because the very things that make us sort of individualists and ideologically correct and embracing the importance and the power of the individual is almost the same psychological predisposition that makes us less effective politically, because ultimately politics is about working with other people. It's the 1 + 1 = 3 philosophy, that you bring people together for one political end. You work cohesively toward that end and diligently. You're going to have a much more greater probability of succeeding than you would, say, if you were individually trying to do that. Or if you had a bunch of individuals who were working in isolation toward the same end, you would have duplication of efforts. You would stumble over each other. You'd have certain areas that wouldn't be covered. It's just not this is an organizational undertaking. And that, of course, requires an organizational approach where everybody sort of realizes that they're going to be more effective within the body of a political movement than they are simply sitting at home writing letters to the editor or writing their congressman. Not to disparage those initiatives, but to sort of say that that's not the way, that's never going to be sufficient enough effort with what we're up against, as you correctly described, in the way of activism on the far left.
So you'd said something that resonated with me, and that is, early on in this election cycle, Chuck and I were probably more in the Ted Cruz camp. And I'm going to guess and say most of the Tea Party was probably in the Ted Cruz camp. But to our own surprise, Donald Trump has ended up becoming more conservative than Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
And what is your thoughts
I think
on
that's
that?
true.
And what's the difference?
Well, and again, it's within the founders, of which I'm one, and of which among national leaders, of which I'm one, there was a strong inclination to support Ted Cruz, because Ted Cruz actively went out and solicited the support of the Tea Party movement. He clearly is a great constitutionalist with an unbelievable understanding of it and adherence to it. And of course, the personal impact of the relationship can't be minimized either. Is that, you get to work with someone of that stature. For a lot of people, that's sufficient for them to sort of say, that's our guy. We know him, we trust him. But there was support for Trump within that body of leaders as well. But then when you go and look at the CNN polling, which I realize has been proven inaccurate repeatedly, but it's really the only body of polling that was done of self-identified Tea Party voters throughout the 2016 election.
That's scary.
Trump was winning among those voters from day one of June 16th, 2015, when he announced that candidacy with the walk down the stairs, and his momentum only built. Now, why is that? I believe it points to the fact that there have been these core issues that are at the centerpiece of the erosion of the middle class in the country that ultimately are concerning to those of centrist and right of center political views that were not being addressed by those inside the Beltway, including, in fairness, by Ted Cruz. And that was particularly the major structural issues that we've had in trade with our major trading partners, particularly with China. And secondly, the major issues that we've had with immigration. And when I say immigration, I'm not just talking about building the wall, which quite obviously needs to be done yesterday, right, but also the overstayed visas, the illogical, visa lotteries, birthright citizenship, all of the components of immigration that just really have not received the level of attention that they deserve. There's been a lot of lip service paid to it. So I've identified Reagan as a conservative. If you went back and looked at Reagan actually did utilize trade tariffs as well against Japan, but he used them in great isolation, very reluctantly. And he spoke rhetorically in support of a secure border. But very little was done from the 1980s until now in the way of actually resolving this.
I was talking about.
I think that
Dennis Prager's show back in the 80s. So
yeah,
it's been going on.
I think that's that was you had some good foresight there, because I think you'd be hard pressed right now to look at any issue confronting the country that is having a more profound effect in so many different ways. I mean, just to take the national security component. I mean, we cannot speak seriously of securing the country without having a secure border. And then you look at the economic impact. You look at the drain on public resources. You look at
Germany.
You
look at England. You look at. Just look.
Yeah, and the people get it. The people get it. I look at these EU elections.
Yeah, really.
Of the past week, it's just an incredible repudiation of open borders and open immigration. An absolute repudiation. I mean, this Brexit party that just prevailed in the UK that really hadn't even existed years ago wins the most votes. I think they had 29 EU seats that they secured. You had, the Macron's party losing in France to Marine Le Pen. In Italy, you had the Salvini League Party, I think it's called, that won, I think, a third of the vote. When I remember 5 years ago, the last
Austria
EU election, they'd have like 5%. Yeah, and obviously Hungary with Orban. This was not like an isolated country where you say, well, yeah, that one country sort of had it with these things. Like I think 2016, the collective thinking, particularly the middle class of Europe, is that the elite governing forces in Brussels, but even in these individual countries, have not had their back on issues of trade or on immigration.
Let me interrupt you for a minute, Michael, and I believe this is true. Socialists never have the middle class back, ever. They talk the game,
No.
they do everything else, but their primary purpose is to get rid of the middle class. And people just don't understand that because of the conversation
and you
and
can't
the talk.
Yeah, you could go back to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and look at everything, including through what's going on with Maduro in Venezuela today. You're not going to identify any degree of success for the middle class. The eradication of the middle class is sort of the first act of socialists.
Exactly.
Is to eliminate that. Why? You might say, why is that politically advantageous? Then politically advantageous because it then puts greater and greater numbers of people dependent on the government for their own personal well-being and survival. Forget success, forget industriousness or productivity or self-actualization. We're talking about these people's very survival. And that's always been the sort of carrot and stick approach that socialists and communists. It's almost a totalitarian way, is to make the people so dependent on the government that the government is empowered, even if its ideas are inherently flawed. And in essence, that really has been and continues to be what's transpiring. Some of the most egregious cases, and Pol Pot's Cambodia, and obviously the Soviet Union's success. They actually eliminated, like literally killed off the whole classes of people.
I wish our middle class would just understand that. If there was some way to just open up their brains and pour this in and say, this is how you have to look at socialism, communism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it. They want to get rid of you. They want you to be the lower class. They don't want you to be the middle class. They don't want you to graduate and become part of the upper.
Absolutely.
Well, Chuck, there's another issue to that too. And let me add to that. And this is something Michael brought up earlier, that conservatives we have this belief that there are certain inalienable rights which are granted by our creator. As we talked about in our previous show with George Soros, the whole open border, the open society socialist model is built on the fact that there are no God-given and alienable rights. There are only the rights that are granted to you by government. God doesn't give you the right to freedom in their model. Government decides what rights you will and will not have. And that's what these people are about.
Yeah, of course, that was the genius of our founders is that they, placed and were clear in pronouncing that they view these rights as being derived from a divine source, not that they themselves had created them, even though they themselves wrote the Constitution, put into place the structural policies that provided for the, propelling in defense of these values. They were values and ideals that they believed came from God, and that's the other thing about socialism. Again, like going back through Lenin and Stalin and Pol Pot and all of these tyrants. What's the other thing that they have completely eradicated? You could put China in this area today.
Faith.
They've eradicated the idea of a God, that there is a there is a God that ultimately has given us life, that there is a God that in some respects is a higher force that provides for, that we'll answer to at some point. And ultimately that there's a God that's more powerful than government, which is, repeatedly pronounced within most major religions.
But
so
you do always
China today.
You always see these people embracing Islam, though.
Yes. Well, and then interestingly, in some cases, you have like what's happening in China right now with the Uyghurs, 1 million of these Muslim Chinese that are being held in essentially concentration camps. It's a huge story to me. I think that, I saw I'm sure you guys did, all of the activism that existed around Guantanamo Bay and the outrage that the left had, that maybe there was a little bit of a chance that there were a few possible innocents being held among these couple hundred people in Guantanamo. Here we have 1 million undeniably innocent people being held exclusively on the basis of their ethnicity and religious affiliation. And most you hear very little about this, including within the political class, about the magnitude of this effort. And then it's not, of course, not just what China's doing there, but also what they're doing to Christians and to Catholics. They're wiping out Christian institutions almost like ISIS did. Obliterating them, bulldozing them.
The socialists don't really care about faith. They don't care about religion. They align themselves with Islam right now because they share some values. But once they defeat the rest of us, they'll turn on each other. So
yeah, I look at it kind of like if you go back to the revolutionary movements in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, they kind of made some loose alliances with the Catholic Church at that time because there were a few common denominators. But ultimately, given the opportunity, getting rid of faith and even people of faith is kind of a centerpiece of how socialism succeeds. And, that ultimately, to your very important earlier point about what is conservatism, well, it stands for all these things. It's a repudiation of some central governing force that has control over all aspects of our society and of our lives. And from their methods, they historically have seen the middle class of a country, faith-based peoples, entrepreneurship, industriousness, even the family unit as being inconvenient toward those ends, and have taken some really systematic steps to try to undermine it, not because of really any ideological predisposition as much as it's politically advantageous and politically necessary for them to be able to prevail, that they get these things out of their way. And that should be terrifying to, I think, any American, regardless of their ideology.
So, Michael, let me ask you one last question here, and that is, you spent time in the Beltway as a speechwriter and working in think tanks, and then you were part of the Tea Party movement.
Right.
What is the difference between conservatism inside the DC Beltway versus conservatism in Middle America?
I think they're monstrous distinctions. One of the things is there's not a sufficient amount of communication between the two bodies. They should be operating, with more collaborative ways, but they're operating separate from each other. And part of that is, inside the Beltway, you're dealing with an educated political class that can gravitate to the most minor issues on an issue and view it as a major fight. And that's not to say that those aren't major fights. Collectively, they all add up to the larger fight. But the American people, I think, are very insightful in the way of identifying societal trends that are threatening to them and to the American way of life. And so some of these themes, particularly the two that I mentioned in trade and immigration that were identified by grassroots conservatives, were sort of ignored by inside the Beltway. I can remember inside the Beltway when we talked about China in the 1990s, early 2000s, the thesis then was, well, yes, the trade practices of China are wholly unfair to American people and to the American worker, but a growing Chinese economy will ultimately become a pluralistic one. It will ultimately reject central control. It will open up the potential of an extraordinary export market to the United States. And of course, what's happened? We have, President Xi now a president for life, a government there that's as authoritarian as it has been, at any time since Mao. There was really a thesis that was perpetuating within the Beltway that ultimately has proved to be fundamentally untrue. I believe the same is true of immigration. I mean, we were told that we're all these buzz phrases, right? We're a nation of immigrants. I love the response from the Tea Party movement, and the American people know we're a nation of citizens. And that somehow this uncontrolled immigration was serving some higher end of the country. If you notice, even the proponents of it, you could never sort of get them to quantify how big did our trade deficit need to be, how many illegals would ultimately be a problem, right? So if you said, we're operating with a $420 billion trade deficit with China right now, which apparently to many of them is not a problem, would it be a problem at $800 billion? How about $1 trillion? Same with the issue on immigration. If you sort of asked if we have 11 to 20 million illegals in the country right now, and that's not a problem to them. Would it be a problem at 20 million? Would it be a problem at 30 million? Would it be a problem at 40 million? You notice they'll never sort of cap the quantifiable or statistic components of these arguments, in large part, in my view, because in doing so, they kind of acknowledge the reality that these are some really, really damaging trends within the country. So the answer to your question is ultimately Washington is, as presidents correctly labeled it, a swamp. It's driven by self-interest, ambition, and money. And those things do not often or always align with the preservation and advocacy of the founding principles of the country or the founding principles of conservatism. So I think in many respects, it's the American people, not Washington, that have salvaged this country. No, I mean, I don't think that's too bold of a statement over the last 10 years. This could have gone in a completely different direction, particularly if Obama had had control of the Congress for 8 years. And given us, well, we haven't turned it around completely. We've at least given a president of goodwill an opportunity now to try to do his best to resolve it. We've lived to fight another day is the way I would sort of phrase it. And
Michael,
if we had allowed,
what can we do to help? And I say we, one is Chuck and myself, and two is the thousands of people that are listening to you right now.
Well, I think the world of what you guys are doing, I think, being able to communicate these grassroots initiatives is so important. And being able to encourage your listening audience to not feel that they're powerless against all of these forces. This can really seem to be intimidating stuff for, a typical American, especially if they haven't had a history of engagement. But to continue to encourage the American people to become politically involved, to work with their neighbors and their friends and their family politically, to get engaged in local Tea Party organizations if they exist, to get involved in the Republican Party. If you don't like the candidates that the Republican Party is putting up, or you don't like the direction of the Republican Party, get in and change it. It ultimately is it's a party that we define what it is and what it stands for, including the principles that it embraces. And so a lot of it is just an encouragement of the American people and people of goodwill, of which there's tens of millions in this country, to not look at the current situation or the forces that we're up against as just being too powerful to resist or to counter, because history has proven just the opposite, that working together, we have the benefit of better ideas, and given the opportunity to articulate and advance those in a democratic political system, there's every reason to believe that we can succeed and that people of the world can succeed. I mentioned the European examples and many examples of that, but that this is just kind of the benefit of a democratic political system. The downside of it is it can be very messy, but the upside of it is there's no limitation to what people working together can do together. If they're committed to a singular end and they're committed to collaborating and working constructively. So, to really just continue to drive that message home and encourage people to become involved, take on issues, work together.
It's so important to define the goal.
And everybody, if you go to the show notes at bluntforcetruth.com, you look up the episode with Michael Johns, you'll find a link there to his website, which is Michael Johns Freedom Prosperity .blogspot.com. We'll have a link there. We'll also have a link to Michael's Twitter and his Facebook. Michael, great having you with us.
Thank you, Michael.
It's a pleasure, guys. Think the world of what you're doing. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And thanks, everybody, for listening to our show today. I hope you enjoyed it. Any comments, let us know. And we'll see you next time on Blunt Force Truth.